and the latest one is called Modernism and Public Reform in Late Imperial Russia. And today Ilya will be sharing with us the results of his research on his broader project on Russian progressivism. So,
thank you, and good morning to those who had enough guts to meet this morning, to face the reality of this morning. Progressivism is a outreach, I would say, theme of my previous research. The book that I just finished is some other topic, but I invested quite a time and effort into doing research for this project on the war. And unfortunately, recently, I've been writing texts that are very difficult to present, to summarize in a brief form. I understand that this is a problem, and the good text should be presented in the introduction and conclusion, leaving everyone satisfied. But I will try, and those who didn't read the whole chapter will please ask me what important things you completely missed in my presentation. I think that the epigraph for my paper can be taken from one of Seinfeld series, this fictive, presumably original title of Leo Tolstoy's novel, War, What Is It Good For? Presumably, war and peace had to be a main given. So, it's August 1915. On the front, Russian troops were being squeezed out of Poland by the German Ninth Army under the command of General von Mackensen. And at the same time, in Petersburg, there are inter-party negotiations in the State Duma going on that were about to result in the creation of the Progressive Bloc that united 56% of the Duma deputies, the absolute majority. At this very time, the Petrograd publishing house Prometheus prepared the second edition of the collection titled What Russia Expects from the War. The first edition of this book was printed just a few months earlier, in March 1915, but was already sold out by August. The success of the collection with readers should obviously be attributed to the very attempt to formulate a distinctive public agenda and to present Russia as an active subject of the historical process underway, rather than a passive victim of diabolic German militarism. This active constructive stance sets this collection apart from a number of other book projects that appeared at about the same time in Russia, often featuring many of the same contributors, commenting mainly on the events or offering advanced interpretations of some deeper meaning behind them. Raising the key question about Russia's own stakes in the Great War, this collection, What Russia Expects from the War, marked the moment when Russian intellectuals claimed for themselves commanding positions in the society's war effort. This happened after half a year of the War of Manifestos, signed by leading cultural figures of the belligerent countries, including Russia, advocating the actions of their respective governments, politicians, and militaries. Now the time obviously had come for the intellectuals to articulate their own visions of the conflict, attempting to impose them upon the society and the ruling class, instead of simply legitimizing the actions of the authorities post facto. Who were those Russian intellectuals that set out to formulate Russia's war goals? In his response to the first edition of the book, written in June 1915, response to the March edition, Vladimir Lenin called it a cadet collection. And this characteristic became an orthodoxy of Soviet historiography, still resurfacing occasionally in Russia. Although today the authors of that 1915 collection are usually identified more cautiously as liberals. Both of these characteristics are misleading in my opinion. Of the 13 contributors to the collection, only 5 were members of the Constitutional Democratic Party, the cadets. Historian Paul Melnikov, but this is certainly a cadet. Nikolai Kareyev, mineralogist Vladimir Vernadsky, physician Andrei Shingayov, and very briefly economist Mikhail Tugan-Baranovsky. However, the pre-revolutionary concept of liberalism, politically represented by cadets on the left flank and Octobrists on the right, can by no means be applied not only to contributors to the collection such as the writer Zinaida Kipius, but also to the already mentioned Mikhail Tugan-Baranovsky, or chemist and art historian Vladimir Kubatov, or physician and women's rights activist Alexeyevna Shishkina-Yavey. Besides members of the Constitutional Democratic Party and proponents of liberalism, at least 4 authors of the collection were Freemasons: Shingayov, Kipius, journalist Maxim Slavinsky, and pedagogue Sergei Znamensky, which of course doesn't make the collection Masonic either. In my chapter, I argue that a certain structural commonality in the approaches to war by contributors to the collection, the diverse body of contributors to the collection, reveals their partaking in a certain common political discourse and a specific social vision, way more important than any formal party affiliation. They demonstrated deliberate internalization of the war by concentrating on Russia's domestic problems as the major challenge to the success of the war effort. Unlike many other collections, there is almost no mention of, with few exceptions, of strategic goals of Russia, of the role of the enemy. It pretty much internal policy papers. The internalization would be reminiscent of the stance of Vladimir Lenin with his slogan of turning a war of the nations into civil war. Their intent, however, was just the opposite: to end the war by getting to its core, by resolving the fundamental internal tensions that had been projected outside the country. In different papers, different chapters in this collection, their authors associated different trends with Germany or Germanic influence. And those trends should have been overcome, despite their utterly patriotic appearance. To some it was cultural Slavophilism, Russian ethnic nationalism, economic isolationism, or expansionism, and so on. A cold civil war became internationalized on a global scale leading to the outbreak of the World War, and it could be ended only by resolving the domestic problems at home, not on the battlefield. This was not a civil war between social classes or political parties, but rather between different answers to the central challenge of modernity: how to reconcile the fundamental and multi-layered heterogeneity of the old regime and the ideal of a single homogeneous nation. And I argue in my chapter that the most important cause of the Great War was exactly the rising tensions within all belligerent countries involved in the conflict, and tensions between different approaches to the same question of homogenization, prospects of homogenization of the polity and society. What did the authors of this collection stand for in this collection? A variety of opinions, sometimes mutually contradictory, expressed by contributors to the collection, produce a complex image of a specific version of modernity. The buzzword of the day in Russia in August 1915 was progressive, and there is no better shorthand to describe and explain the group of contributors to the collection who were a coalition of political liberals and enlightened conservatives, positivist scientists and preachers of moral reform, Freemasons and social engineers. And the latter term entered the Russian language in November 1915 in printing. As in the post-Gilded Age in the United States, a loosely defined progressivism became a common denominator in Russia for a broad spectrum of public forces seeking social reforms without radical revolutionary upheaval. The transatlantic culture of social reformism drove the apolitical politics or network mobilization as a system of multiple campaigns for individual causes involved Russian educated society as well. Scholars just don't fully realize how widespread and persistent the ethos of progressivism in Russia was. Well beyond the ranks of the namesake Progressive Party, factions of reform-minded progressives in city councils in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and after August 1915, the dominant progressive bloc in the Duma. Russian progressivism was both an autochthonous phenomenon, a logical development of the populist concept of small deeds of the 1880s, and a participant in the universal pan-Atlantic reformist movement. It gained momentum in the wake of the abortive revolution of 1905, when, in the words of the Russian propagator Alexander Howard's Garden City movement, Sam Dadonov, and quote, amid the universal loss of the interest in politics, Howard's idea of socialism without politics had all the chances for a most broad dissemination in Russia. In the new social reality of party politics and mass society, progressives sought new venues for non-partisan and socially inclusive communication in place of gentlemen clubs and aristocratic salons of the epoch of classic liberalism. This explains the prominence of voluntary academic societies and Masonic lodges in sustaining the progressive movement, particularly in Europe, where many social barriers had persisted after the demise of the old regime. Progressivism became dominant in Russian educated society only with the crisis and demise of the Grand Russia, as the normative format of self-organization scenario of social activism in the wake of the 1905 revolution. Before that, homegrown Russian progressivism developed in the shadow of a parallel tradition of Jacobean radicalism, stigmatized by its claim to moral superiority over the small deeds of the big bourgeoisie. Still, despite its moral weight, actual membership in underground Russia was insignificant, and only the revolutionary high tide of 1904-06 for a few years granted it unconditional superiority. Despite these delays and setbacks, Russian progressivism was developed enough to differentiate among several main paradigms, not unlike the archetypal American counterpart. The most important product of Russian progressivism, albeit undeveloped, was the emerging vision of the imperial political nation, modeled after the concept of Great Britain. This precursor of the idea of the British Commonwealth. Roughly between 1910 and 1915, the two extreme poles of Russian public opinion, pan-imperial modernizers and activists of nationality movements, don't want to call them nationalists, both poles had evolved and achieved a compromise, an agreement about the possibility of the internal decolonization of Russia on the model of Great Britain. The new imperium, the quote from Struve, was envisioned as a commonwealth of local ethnocultural communities bound together by the pan-imperial political loyalty and Russian language universal public sphere, fully acknowledging the parallel existence of local circuits of national culture and loyalties. This vision was neither universally accepted nor fully elaborated to the extent of becoming a distinctive political program. Still, the very idea of Russian imperial political nation, accommodating different nationalities and protecting their rights, dramatically broadened the spectrum of imaginable possibilities. As such, it could now be debated by intellectuals and activists and became an element of the political process. This compromise became possible thanks to the rise of Russian progressivism as a new intellectual middle ground, a sphere of general consensus about basic values that united social reformers in a very broad diapason of party affinities. The 4 or 5 main currents in progressivism advanced a variety of moral, social, economic, and political reforms, partially overlapping or even mutually contradictory. A consensus position regarding the desirability or possibility of war was a matter of personal choice and political convictions, such as one's support for the Social Democratic or Optimist Party program. There was, however, a more fundamental factor that determined the position of Russian progressives vis-à-vis the war in general. The structurally introverted orientation of progressivism, with its primary focus on domestic problems, made the war the least important and least relevant instrument for achieving political and social goals on the list of priorities. This is not to say that Russian progressivism was peaceful or pacifist, just that the war was not the first choice for those wishing to sober the country, curb prostitution and white slavery, develop new economic thinking among peasants, protect the rights of Ukrainians, or push for constitutional reform. These people were not even necessarily against the war. It was just not part of their social imagery. That is, among the Russian progressives, even the vanguard idea of a greater Russia was more developed and widespread than the seemingly self-evident and fundamental notion of war. Whatever one's personal views on foreign politics were, it was very difficult to distill them directly from any of the small deeds campaigns that were central to progressivism. The proverbial indifference of Russian progressives to foreign affairs resulted from a very special type of progressive social thinking. When it was applied to self-mobilization in support of the country's war effort, the effect was as powerful as it was unpredictable. The very success of progressive type of political politics worldwide became the greatest challenge to the original premises of the movement. We know the archetypal story of American progressives turning to the state sometime after 1915, the development of the new republic. The independence from the existing political institutions deemed corrupt and inefficient in early progressivism, and reliance upon public campaigns for specific causes sooner or later centralized the problem of sustaining the reformist effort. Public enthusiasm couldn't be carried out on for more than several years for any individual cause, and there was an urgent need to rely on some self-regulated machine of human resources mobilization in order to sustain the determination and enthusiasm of the followers above and beyond any ideological alliances. Progressives created new institutions or modified the existing ones for their needs, and began seeking an alliance with the state inasmuch as the system became more and more willing to accommodate their ideas and their leaders. Already on the eve of World War I, a book under the title entitled Progressivism and After was published as an early warning of the coming US war. Its author, leftist progressive William Walling, one of the few American members of the British Federalist Society, argued that the time had come to take the next logical step from progressivism to state socialism, getting past the stage of state capitalism. In a way, he anticipated the subsequent evolution of progressivism and progressives worldwide, usually attributed to the social mobilization of the World War period and the rise of the interventionist state and state social policies. The case of Walling is important as proof that this evolution was immanent to progressivism itself, even without the wartime emergency. Progressivism had created the public opinion and political momentum that favored a reconciliation of the public movement for social reform with the state on new terms, thus defining both the state and the reform priorities. Russian progressivism had to oppose much more hostile political regime than British or American colleagues. On the eve of the war, progressives had all but harnessed the Zemstvo network of rural self-government and began encroaching on a number of major municipal councils. But this was as much access to institutional authority as they could get, institutionalized authority. The dominant self-identification of Russian progressives with a self-organized and self-mobilized politically conscious public общественность remained. Then the war began, and we see from the collection that I discussed in my chapter, that leading Russian progressives suddenly began endorsing the state from which they had been carefully distancing themselves only several months earlier. The transformation of an Ataman priest of the imperial state, Maxim Slavinsky, seemed particularly strange. He declared in March 1915, and I quote, "The paths of the Russian intelligentsia and the Russian state have crossed, and all the peoples of Russia have come to this intersection. A single path for everyone lies ahead, lighted as by columns of fire by the visions of law and justice." These words might sound like resolved exaggeration, but a similar quote by another progressive, Sergei Prokopyevich, explains this unexpected enthusiasm for the state. 1 year later, in February 1916, At the Second Congress of Representatives of the Military Industrial Committees, and we know that they were instrumental in sustaining the war effort, Prokopyevich declared, and I quote, "So, the slogan of the moment should be the unification of all elements in the country under the public flag in alliance with the government. Not with the government that rules now and leads society toward trouble, but with the government that society has been calling for and demanded since long ago, the real government. When we speak of unity with the government, we are speaking of this particular government, and it is with this government that we will have to arrange the application of all of the healthy, already organized elements of the country. Only through this complete unification will it become possible to achieve real results." Applause. 1 year later, in February 1917, the wishful thinking of Slavinsky and the explicit political claim of Prokopyevich became reality with this revolution. The mobilized society at last received the government willing to acknowledge and accommodate the demands. The provisional government was provisional in more than one sense. The multifaceted coalition of progressives could be very productive as a lobbying group within the established political system, but lacked the legitimacy to mobilize supreme authority in the country, and didn't have a political machine of their own to rely upon in governing the society. Progressives are against party machines. So progressives coming to the power, to the position of authority, they have no political machine to rely upon. By its very nature, progressivism was incompatible with revolution as a movement of peaceful social reformism, also known in Russia under the names of peaceful renovation, democratic reforms, or even no titles, people without designation, pursuing the program of small deeds. Ideology. They thought so. Paradoxically, it became a much stronger revolutionary force than the most radical revolutionary parties. Theirs was the politics of the future, hypothetical socialism and abstract ideals with a very narrow potential constituency of revolutionarism. Progressivism was about achieving immediate practical results, easy to grasp and support. When Russian progressivism went to the war, it began doing what it did the best, finding permanent solutions to partial problems. The potential of Zemstva and municipal reform movements was used to establish the Union of Zemstvos and the Union of Towns, later merged into Zemgovor, as the institutional framework of society's wartime mobilization. The military-industrial committees grew out of private conferences held by Moscow progressivist entrepreneurs of the Bolshinsky Circle and acted as a body coordinating the military efforts of industry. The government de facto surrendered many of its key responsibilities in the war to the organized public mind, a progressivist formula coined by Alexander Chiav, while having virtually no control over the territories controlled by the army, as was discussed yesterday. The few key functions that still remained the sole responsibility of the government included food procurement and regulation of transport, and the public consensus was that the government had failed miserably on both accounts. The war effort of the empire was largely conducted by the self-organized and self-mobilized society, in accordance with the archetypal progressivist worldview. The ultimate obstacles on the path to peace and victory were not the German and Austrian troops, but those internal enemies that sabotaged the rational and efficient organization of the defense. The mobilized progressive imperial nation, or the would-be Great Russia, simply didn't need the kind of rulers that would head the country, for all practical purposes, not because of some political disagreement. The redundancy of Nicholas II and his ministers was so obvious that their stubborn sabotage of the nation's war effort raised more astonishment than wrath. And this is how I read the famous speech by Milukov. I used to think that it was, demagogic threatening, but it was sincere expression of astonishment. What is it, stupidity or treason? Asked Milukov on November 1st, 1916. 8 months after the Second Congress of Military Industrial Committees applauded the early warning of the government to the government by Sergei Prokopyevich. It was the former, it was stupidity. Nicholas dared to stage a coup against the nation by attempting to dissolve the Duma with its progressive court as the shadow cabinet, with devastating consequences for himself and eventually for the progressive nation. Thank you.
Maybe some of the definition of it. I don't think you can develop in paper, but you might hint at it's there. First of all, I come back to this book I mentioned yesterday, The Dynamics of Destruction by Kramer or Kramer. He spends a lot of time talking about the German intellectual artistic world's Aufruf an Kulturwelt or something like that. How German intellectuals of certain political persuasions kind of united in a defense of German culture. It was meant to, I think it was meant to appeal to the world, but it was really a domestic appeal to rouse national patriotism for the German cause. So one, and I think it's a very different story from the story you're telling. The other thing is you wouldn't be surprised when I talk about this Ukrainian connection. The Rada government was formed on the basis of something called the Tavaristvo Ukrainskih Progressistov. So they thought of themselves as progressives. They also didn't like parties and had a terrible time making relationships with either the SR party or the Menshevik party or the Bolshevik, especially the Bolshevik party, but also with the cadets. And they all kind of practice this kind of coalition politics too, in which they kind of overlook a lot of the difficult issues to hang together against whatever was aggressive. And so, and after all, yesterday we heard that both Krzyzewski and Savienko were able to be on a Skoropadsky government panel. So there's some strange kind of boundaries that we used to think were more secure, which I think we're now discovering are a lot more porous and fluid. I just recently, on the same line, I had to review an otherwise painful book by Stephen Velichchenko about continuity of several Ukrainian governments at a sort of middle-level bureaucracy level. He said remarkable continuity from Directory to Rada to Skoropadsky, even into the communist states. These middle-level bureaucrats kind of don't seem to care about ideology. They have some bigger and progressive second kind of possibly orientation. And then the other thing is, I know you've worked with Hinkson, but this sounds so much, I wish David McDonald were here because he could be the real spokesman for Hinkson, but that whole crisis of political parties article, he wrote long and Uralt article, and it sounds like you're doing another stage of this, which is very productive and helps explain kind of politics a lot better than many of the. Finally, four-point question: revolutionary defenses and progressive. It seems that the way you're describing the progressives transition from opposition to state to kind of wishing for their state to practicing kind of state politics, called parastate politics in Hebrews words. They started getting used to the idea of liking the state, and that makes their attitude where they might have been indifferent to the war, as you say, 1915, by 1917 they become revolutionary defenses. You can talk to SR, you can talk to Mensheviks, cadets, and all agree on kind of revolutionary defenses, patriotism that they couldn't have probably before.
Should we have a few questions?
Yeah, I also really like the paper. And my question is about the term progressive. So we have a progressive party, progressive bloc, a larger progressive movement, and you're seeing a lot of progressivism among people that don't want to have themselves identified. And I'm wondering if there are boundaries to that, or how you define that. In other words, if you are a member of Zemgor and you're out on the front acting in that capacity, are you by definition a progressive? Or are there other people engaged in this sort of obsessiveness during the war that aren't progressive, and who would those be, and how would you think of this?
Further questions?
I do have a question, but this is very specific. It was not covered in the oral presentation, but it's in the paper. And that specific question is the position of Kovalevsky in the context, Maxim Maximovich Kovalevsky, in the context of progressive movement. Because I do believe that Kovalevsky, he ran on the cadet ticket to the first Duma in Kharkov. And then before the election to the First Duma and after the election of the First Duma, Kovalevsky was not only saw the relevance of the structures of the politics, the party politics and the representation, but he had also a deep evolutionist thinking about Russia being backward and therefore more restrictive, more elitist forms of liberalism should be applied rather than more democratic, more inclusive. And he emphasized that several times. He positioned himself on these questions also explicitly, he said, more conservative than the cadets. Right? So he did that, and then his position in the State Council, to which he ended up to be a member of which he ended up to be a member of, is also clear. Trying to lay out this kind of conservative weight. We don't. And I think you say at one point he said he was bewildered. Why people are not happy with the Hooligan Duma. There's more conservatism built into the evolutionist paradigm of Kovalevsky that. No, I mean you say at some point you say that there is a general progressive thing, but and put him on par with people who were thinking more democratically. Democratically doesn't mean party line, more inclusive, less elitist, less conservative. I have a problem fitting him into this general picture. I think he had this European Chicherin kind of thing. Russia is too young, wait, let's use more conservative examples of political representation, party organization in this. Sorry to be long, but that's a very specific thing where I have a disagreement.
Just really not a separate comment, but just to sort of pick up on Josh and sort of endorse what he said and what we just heard. I guess when I read this, I was thinking, where is the boundary on progressives and where then are conservatives, where are the right cadets, where does support for the war begin and progressive mobilization, and where's the boundary between those two? And I think if that could be delimited a little bit more clearly in the paper, would help, I think, conceptually.
Several questions down the room.
Now, some questions for later the part of the paper that read in the full chapter and not in this presentation. Actually, I would be interested to do something together with German colleagues or specialists on Germany, because I briefly discussed in the paper the prehistory of this collection, which started with the War Manifestos and Sasha Dmitriev published on these when after the outbreak of the war and the Belgian atrocities by the Germans, now the French and British art and culture activists signed letters of protest, and the Germans all mobilized in support. And then the first collection of the type was published by the British Oxford historians, who produced this academic volume discussing in depth the prehistory of the war. Then there were Russians only in the fall or in the summer, I don't remember it now, the paper back in February. And the Germans followed this suit, and instead of the usual propaganda, they published a collection similar in scope. So I was puzzled by this German, and no less than Kakarev was and Kovalevsky, they were puzzled by the reaction of their German colleagues. To them, these progressives that I mentioned in the paper, all of them were pro-war, they were defensive. Revolutionary or not, but they were certainly for the defense of the country. They just were against politicizing culture and science, and were against the German and young Russian colleagues' attempts to use war as good cultural arguments in political war mobilization, and explicitly stated that war is one thing, but claiming that German science and German culture nothing, it's just abomination, and that they were all indebted to Germany and to his colleagues for that matter. So I don't know what happened with Germans, and people belonging to the same, however they define progressively, why they display absolutely different patterns. This is really just an interesting problem, and this was bothered me. Ukrainian progressives in 1917, Kerensky dispatched no one else but Maxim Slavinsky as envoy to negotiate with Russia. And only when negotiations failed, Slavinsky changed sides. He was and explicitly became a Ukrainian national activist. He had a dubious reputation in Ukrainian historiography. Because people who know better, that they know that he was quite loyal to the empire and had nothing to do against the great. And his idea of imperial nation was explicitly anti-Grushevsky and should be very subversive from the point of view of Grushevsky orthodoxy. The bounds of progressivism, how to define the basic question is it useful? Don't we, as happens every 10 years or so in our profession, when we find a new word, to just recode the old debates and to refresh, to facelift, to make them more attractive, and calling the spade or something to make it more attractive. That's the question. If it's so, we don't need this. Now, why the concept of the framework of progressivism can be useful? It can be useful to discuss it for discussion of the internal structure of Russian intellectual society beyond party affiliation. Because this paradigm has been explored for the past several decades and went to its limits. I mean, we know, doing the best estimates by historians find several thousand party members, all party members combined, except for Bund. Well, Bund alone has, even in the early 10s, when it was the period of demobilization, political demobilization, as many members as all parties in the empire combined. I mean, we can make certain arguments from this. I don't think it's scientific, academically valid. It's about Jews, the fair, what about the agitation, political agitation. Otherwise, party membership was very limited. We know that all kinds of undercover public negotiations between parties were underway. We need some framework to capture this state of mind. Now we know that let's take American progressives as an archetype, just because it's useful, because there is enormous body of literature on American progressives. How to draw a boundary, how to define who is American progressive. It's Wilsonian or Teddy Rooseveltian kind of progressivism. People who were leaning towards socialism, who were conservative. I mean, progressive is useful as middle ground. Now, if currently we have the only concept that we can use as this overarching general framework, and as middle ground, historical middle ground for those people, modernity. Now, I think that it's been abused already too much, and the explanatory potential of the concept is very limited. Well, everybody is modern, fascists are modern, social democrats are modern, gay people are modern, anti-gay people certainly very modern. Of course, I don't, as political activists. I mean, it's getting pretty much meaningless at some point. Bolsheviks are modern, but they're differently modern than Maxim Kavalevsky that Sasha mentioned. It's important to understand what different currents of modernity exist, and the political programs built in those, even in art movements, certain connotations that are built in. But that's it. Now, progressivism allows us to discuss party or non-party groupings, programs that were not being political at the time, or understood as such at that time, and help us to understand how Rябушинski indeed could to meet with Mensheviks, because and how they, and when you actually read proceedings of military war committees, when there are industrialists and working class activists there, that their language and how they try to find a common language or common ground, it's certainly not political. They discussing rationality, but not necessarily in the sense that the modern school would imply. It was not necessarily about power, it was about finding rational solutions to concrete problems in the political situation. We understand that there is political consequences and political agendas built in, and it's good. And the American historiographer progressively gives us these apparatus and tools, allowing us to work analytically with it. And it's also very interesting that we find the language of self-description, progressive language of self-description. The people actually call themselves progressive. And in the paper I mentioned the story of the founding of the Progressive Party that went through several stages looking for new name every couple of years, finally settled on Progressive. So it was quite a conscious also search for that ended up in realization that all Progressive was most neutral. Yes, it's neutral, it's as empty as modernity, everything's modern, everything's progressive. And yet people found it was concrete enough between revolution and reaction. It's reform, not revolutionary reformism of all shades. Now there are different certain flanks there, more radical, more conservative, but those people who are pro-change, but without radical upheaval. Now this is pretty broad, but at the same time with certain limits, clear limits, sphere that we actually find in the revolutionary society, and we can discuss it in these categories, I believe, productively. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I agree. I mean, one of the really convincing things about your paper is how progressivism sort of helps to color a lot of this activity during the war. But I guess I was just getting a little, not uncomfortable, but feeling like it had gotten stretched too far when you started saying things like it had colored a lot of the social mobilization for the war. Let's take an example, members of the royal family who organize, care for refugees, care for the needy. You know, Grand Duchess Tatiana, is she progressive, right? And so, I guess it's that sort of specificity. I mean, I agree with you that progressivism is a big part of this, but clearly there's a lot of social mobilization that is not progressive. What you came to at the end there, it's reformist without being, reactionary. I mean, that's the sort of thing I would always like to see.
The formula that is self-organized, self-mobilized social movement. Now, for the Tatiana society, you need actually a group of followers. Now, when you have both the princess and not just several cousins, but certain constituency, and it's certainly communicated through public discourse and certain public discourse behind this. And now this is called, yes, progressive, even the countess or princess, no discrimination, right?
And the fact that they invited people from YMCA to the war and participate in this actually, suggests that certainly even within the society still have members of the royal family. It's an interesting work on that.
I may offer a comment. It's in connection with Marx and you mentioning this German angle involvement with the Germans during the war. And I think actually the kind of verbal war, this kind of exchanges between the Russian intellectuals, academics and the German counterparts is very, very important to understanding how the kind of very concept of Europe and the West is redefined during this period. It's from kind of material I saw and it relates to academics most. It's sort of the German side initiates open letters, which are incredibly anti-Russian, so presenting Russia as a land of barbarism and completely outside of European civilization. And the Russian side reads these open letters, sees signatures. That's their friends, heroes. Many of these Russian academics are of German origin anyway, but they are Russian patriots. And the reaction they comment in their letters, their diaries, they're completely shocked. And then they kind of respond in kind to this verbal abuse by either arguing that in fact Germany is not necessarily Europe, or it did say yes, Russia is not Europe, but they are better, sort of moving into the direction of the Eurasians. But I think maybe this exchange is so shocking for Russian educated elite that it's actually very formative to their worldview and the change of opinion on what Russia is, how it relates to Europe. So we have to take this seriously. And indeed, I don't know whether anyone has read this letter. German classical philologists were particularly mad. I think they're terrible. They was my students when I studied physics in Leningrad University in the late Soviet period. You really can't believe what they write.
And despite these absolutely horrible letters, people in collection that I use as a center for the discussion, the majority of them, except for who is art historian, the older generation, they resisted. And Yakareev explicitly attacked Vladimir Lenin with his famous paper from Kant to Krug. He mocked him. He said, we shouldn't do it. And this is a very interesting hypothesis that he suggests that exactly those who experienced the influence of German, not culture, the ideologists probably, the idealists and Marxists, they were those who turned into these Slavophiles, agitators, which to him was the German within. The German within was more dangerous than German out there. And Slavophiles and Russian patriots to them were more dangerous than German themselves, although they were dismayed, of course, by the way.
Other questions?
I was just, it's also a comment on this line of thinking about singling out Germany as a case that is, if that route taken, then that leads to destruction, and this is not the route to take. I think it has a longer lineage, and it will be interesting to see this resistance to a certain rationalization equated with the things German. Whether that was harking back to those discourses from before the war, because at the very same time, it's interesting enough, the German pathways were very different. I mean, people were discussing renewal of liberalism. Weber was changing his position on whether national autonomy can actually work or not. Weber is discussing it with explicit reference to the Russian Revolution. All these things are happening, and it will be, probably nice to have a footnote that things German were very different, not to mention that they Habsburg. I think it is a very interesting reflection when the intensity, and this is where we get to the comparative aspect of it, the intensity of the war, the engagement of the war, forced people to think comparatively and use these comparative frames to look at own countries and own situations. And that can even be stressed as a point in the presentation, that this is one of the peculiar characters of the war situation, of the intense engagement and the kind of mirroring and reflection of the different situations in the belligerent countries. So that,
Actually, maybe in my position as a chair, absolutely agree with you, Sasha. I thought about the same thing yesterday when we had a discussion. And it runs counter what you were saying, and I'm thinking as well that the war is actually a period of increased interaction. It runs counter to the perception of people, certainly academics, at the time. They're saying the war actually creates all these boundaries, we stop communicating, basically by the second decade of the 20th century, we're having a common kind of pan-European intellectual sphere, which then disintegrates during the war. And in some ways, yes, maybe it was more difficult to organize international research projects during the war, and literature exchange of publications has become more difficult because of the situation to the post. But in other ways, sort of interest in the other increases, and the kind of intensity and sharpness of the dialogue increases as well. So do we have any other comments, questions on Lydia's paper? If not, thank you very much, Lydia. Now we're moving to our second paper by Sergei Levov, another editor of Other Theory and the leading specialist on the Eurasian movement. Sergei recently published a very, very useful collection of documents related to the history of this movement. Again, today's paper is on the Eurasians.
Thanks, Vera. I think thinking how what I do relates to World War I, and thanks to Marina Vosskova, who actually found this little typo on the folder for the conference, where it says International Project, Russia's Great War and Evolution. And now I think things are very clear. We are going to talk a little bit about evolution. This connection is firmly established. Now, of course, First World War was a universally destructive experience, but one could argue with a degree of assertiveness that interruptions in Russian intellectual life were probably greater than in other European countries, simply because as a result of the Bolshevik takeover in October 1917 of Russian intellectuals, and of course the Civil War, had to either go into exile or undergo various kinds of deportations, arrests, and abysmal living conditions, and such. And a lot of people continued their intellectual work in what was to date the largest political immigration in modern European history, in different capitals of Russia abroad. And their thinking and their interactions and their sort of institutional affiliations were shaped in the context of that political immigration. On the other hand, if we are to look at two most important intellectual, from a certain perspective, most important intellectual developments in late imperial Soviet Russia, and this is of course a different kind of intellectual activity than Ilya was talking about, then we will probably think about the religious philosophical thought, something that's related to the Russian religious philosophical societies on the one hand, and this is a kind of neo-Kantian religious and liberal nationalist philosophy of the last decade of imperial Russia. On the other hand, it's the Husserlian and phenomenological ideas of the study of language, which in the interwar period became most clearly associated with the work of Nikolai Trubetskoy as a linguist, Roman Jakobson, and the Prague Linguistic Circle. And in a very interesting way, both of these large areas of intellectual activity crossed in the Eurasianist movement, which I'm not going to go into much detail about, and it's probably very well familiar to all present, which was active between roughly 1920 and 1929 as an organized political, philosophical movement, and which also fascinatingly articulated what was probably the first instance of a very reflective and a very coherent critique of what the Eurasianists actually called cultural imperialism of Europe. Now, in itself, this phenomenon, the articulation of what we might call, in quotes, provisionally post-colonial rhetoric in Eurasianism, seems to be part of a larger array of phenomena and developments in late imperial period Soviet Russia. There's work demonstrated how Russian Orientologists criticized certain forms of disciplinary knowledge coming from the West, and of course Mark mentioned the work of Mikhail Pokrovsky and his school in Soviet Russia. We have to, of course, remember the titles of works like Kolonialная политика царизма and this or that part of the Soviet Union. By comparison, Eurasianism was radical, but maybe not even that radical. Another important context which I think should be mentioned is that Eurasianism, although it was a very interesting and multifaceted attempt to remap Europe and the old world in the aftermath of the war, it was not unique. And members and participants of the Eurasianist movement were aware of attempts such as, for example, the ideas of the Austrian aristocrat Count Richard Kalergi, who was the leader of the pan-European movement. And it's, by the way, very interesting that Kalergi's ideas actually excluded Great Britain and Russia from his idea of Europe, because the argument both were kind of outwardly looking into their colonial possessions, whereas parts of Africa were included into pan-Europe because they were needed for natural resources or rather other reasons. And Belgian socialists played with the concept of Euro-Africa, an idea where European nations would peacefully unite on the continent for the purpose of a more rational and sustained exploitation of the resources of the Black Continent. So even in terms of kind of re-envisioning the map of Europe and the aftermath of the war, Eurasianism was not unique. What was unique, however, about the Eurasianists in comparison to those people, in comparison to Kalergi and Belgian socialists, is that the Eurasianists had the idea of sort of double colonization. On the one hand, the perceived colonization of Russia, some kind of utopian vision of Russia, by the European cultural tradition emanating from the Enlightenment, of course brought to Russia by Peter the Great, and culminating in the Bolshevik Revolution. So the revolution itself was not so much a social development as it was an uprising of unwashed Eurasians against the civilized Europeans, cultural revolution. And second, many of the Eurasianists found themselves, as many emigres, by the way, in a situation in which they resented what they perceived as the lack of support by the former allies and the sort of denigrating attitudes of the French and the British to the Russians. There were attempts to participate by Russian emigres as sort of spokesmen on behalf of the Russian state in different conferences, in different negotiations, especially about the territorial issues. For example, Anton Kartashov in 1921 wrote an interesting letter to the British government regarding Bessarabia and its belonging to the Russian state. He was, of course, an emigre living in Yugoslavia at the time, with no power and no influence whatsoever. The position itself, however, is very, very important. It certainly contributed to a sense of being sort of on the colonial side of the world. Much of the Eurasianist anti-colonialist rhetoric comes from the works of Nikolai Sergeyevich Trubetskoy. I actually think that this text Европа и человечество, Europe and Mankind, that was published in Sofia in 1920, it's a very well-known text, but it's still largely very poorly understood. And we don't even know how well received it was in different parts of the world. In Germany, of course, it was translated, not surprisingly, in German and Japanese. In German, it was translated by Roman Jakobson's brother, Sergei Jakobson, and the foreword was written by Otto Hertz, who was one of the leading experts in German Ostforschung. Into Japanese, it was translated by Shimano Saburo, who was a sort of an expert on things Soviet, who was employed in Manchuria by the Japanese government, and who later went to establish Soviet studies in Japan. This work by Trubetskoy, essentially, in some of its parts, it's fairly simple. It argues that European culture is often perceived as cosmopolitan, whereas it's really just a reflection of specific historical conditions which used to be actually described in courses like West Sea for the development of Europe not so long ago in the United States. And that in sort of this move from European particularism to the notion of cosmopolitanism, there is a power interest hidden somewhere. And Trubetskoy went after that interest, that power interest. Now, what is also, I think, fascinating is that Trubetskoy continued to construct Russia, even Soviet Russia under the Bolsheviks, as a colonial country. In 1922, in the second Eurasianist collection, he argued that in order to reconstruct the country's economy and secure the liberation of Russia from the Bolsheviks, the help of foreigners will be indispensable. But these foreigners are representatives of those very great powers that have conducted the World War. By now, we know who they truly are. The war has washed away the Tsars and the Rouge from the humanist Romano-Germanic civilization, and now the descendants of the ancient Gauls and Germans have shown the world their true face, the face of the predator, greedily chattering with its teeth. This predator needs prey and food, and if you won't give it to it, the beast will take it itself, for it has technology, culture, and science at its service, and most importantly, cannons and battleships. Russia was doomed to lose its independence, and it did not matter what kind of government it will have. It will be a fictitious government, reminiscent of colonial governments in Bukhara, Siam, or Cambodia. And as far as the population was concerned, Trubetskoy remarked, it's a very interesting remark, given his professional life, it will be left to ethnographers to deal with. Although many representatives of Eurasianism celebrated the Bolsheviks' restoration of Russia's statehood, Trubetskoy did not take much solace in the concept of world revolution according to the communist scenario. Borrowing almost verbatim from Bakunin's polemics with Marx in this fascinating connection, which Trubetskoy, of course, does not cite, he argued that without this revolution, Russia would have been a colony of bourgeois Romano-Germanic nations, and after that revolution, she will be a colony of communist Europe. The page of history upon which it was written that Russia is a great European power is over once and forever. From now on, Russia has entered its new phase of development, the phase of the loss of independence. The future of Russia is a colonial country similar to India, Egypt, or Morocco. And now we come to this very interesting point in the text of Europe and Mankind, where Trubetskoy actually begins to use language that comes very close to what we see in the works of Edward Said. In particular, where he sees the power of European civilization realized through the ideology of supremacy, which was above all reflected in misguided disciplinary knowledge and evolutionist conceptions of history and culture. And I quote, it's a lengthy quote, but I think it's a very important one. The moment of evaluative judgment has to be purged once and forever from ethnography and history of culture, as well as from all evolutionary disciplines in general. For evaluative judgment is always based upon egocentrism. There are no superior and inferior cultures, there are only similar and different ones. To declare that those that are similar to ours are superior and those that are different from ours are inferior is arbitrary, non-scholarly, naive, and finally simply unintelligent. European evolutionary disciplines, in particular ethnography, anthropology, and history of culture, can become real scientific disciplines only when they will have overcome this deeply rooted superstition and will expunge its consequences from their very methods and conclusions. Until this is done, they remain in the best case a means to fool people into justifying the eyes of the Roman Germans and their accomplices, the imperialist colonial policies, and it's a very angry language, the vandalistic Kulturträgerschaft of the great powers of Europe and America. So, where does this come from? And what does it have to do with either the war or the Russian Revolution or the Russian intellectual tradition? Of course, there is a part of Trubetskoy thinking which is diversitarian, which privileges difference as a sort of meaning-constructing category. And this is also present in Trubetskoy's linguistics and Trubetskoy's phonology. And this is a sort of a rather technical comment, but in phonology, phonemes acquire meaning only if they are in a sort of a differentiated relation with each other. And this is largely a sort of a theological concept of Trubetskoy, which opposes the totalizing impact of the idea of universal culture. It's religious, of course. In 1922, Trubetskoy was asked to write a linguistic article for the Eurasianist collection. He never did it, but he wrote in a letter to Sobczynski kind of a plan of the article. And this is what he says. I have a plan for a whole-breadth theological substantiation of the idea of nationally delimited cultures. The article will be called The Tower of Babel and the Division of Languages. These are my theses. International culture, ipso, is godless and leads only to the construction of the Tower of Babel. The plurality of languages and cultures is established by God in order to prevent the new Tower of Babel. Any attempt to break this law established by God is godless. True cultural values can be created only by a nationally delimited culture. Christianity is above cultures and can sanctify any national culture by transforming it without decreasing its originality. As soon as the spirit of internationalism begins to spread in Christianity, it ceases to be true. So we see the connection here with the sort of theological interests of Trubetskoy. There is also an element in Trubetskoy's ideology which we can relate to sort of generic fascism, the criticism of modernity as this totalizing, universalizing, and difference-eliminating phenomenon. And another quote from Trubetskoy about futurism. Sobczynski and other Eurasianists were very interested in that, and so there was an exchange about it. And Trubetskoy said about the futurists the following. When a futurist who rebelled against beauty paints and describes the European culture of plants and factories, this hideous and perverted creation of human hands, this abominable Tower of Babel, such futurist is in his sphere, for savoring and enjoying deformity is a rebellion against beauty. The essence of the first cause of futurism is exactly the savoring and celebration of the machine gas and creed European modernity, and this is exactly what attracts the futurism and its adepts. In fact, this kind of rhetoric, which perceives politics as well as aesthetics, was later translated into a very specific conception of the state, which is very, very close to fascism. It was probably borrowed in part by Trubetskoy from Otmar Spahn, who was the ideologist of Ständerstaat in Austria. Now, finally, a tiny little detail which has something to do with the way things are hidden in this text in Europe and Mankind. Trubetskoy didn't cite a single author in it, so all the connections have to be restored by doing a little bit of detective work of sorts. He mentioned to Roman Jakobson that the ideas that he developed in Europe and Mankind go back a decade. The letter was written, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 1921, so we can presume museum. It's about 1911 or so. And although this might have been true, I think the very direction in which the book is written is a direct result of the personal experiences of the Revolutionary War. What was Trubetskoy doing in 1911? In 1911, he was visiting Vsevolod Miller's dacha in the Caucasus, and Miller was studying the Ossetians, and Trubetskoy was also doing a study of Ossetian folklore at the time. And this brings forth the kind of discussions that Marina described in her work, in particular the debate between Anuchin and Kovalevsky on the sort of preparedness of different peoples of the Russian Empire for full-scale political life and participation. Miller and Kovalevsky were co-authors in their multi-volume study of the Caucasus, and Miller was very close to Kovalevsky's idea. So we can presume that some of the rhetoric in Europe and mankind is probably directed against Kovalevsky's kind of sort of attempt to structure the Russian Empire internally into some kind of national core and colonial perimeters. And finally, the afterlife of this text is also very interesting. It was largely forgotten in the period following 1945, but by one person. And that person was Roman Josipovich Jakobson, who absorbed these ideas and the notion of the hierarchies, cultural hierarchies in the production of knowledge very thoroughly. He was, throughout his career, very attentive to those relations of power that are embedded in sort of the idea of national science and the belonging of a scholar to a particular national science, in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, or the United States. Before his death, the translation of Europe and Mankind into Italian and its publication was Jakobson's last project. He wrote an interesting introduction to it, and he argued in the introduction that these were the ideas that they discussed with Trubetskoy back before World War I, and which, he suggested, made its way into his conception of structure. It remains to be seen how much of this kind of rhetoric actually was translated by Jakobson to scholars like Gorky Strauss, but this remains to sort of along the project. I'm interested in hearing how we can think about Eurasianism as an aftermath of World War I and how we can relate it to sort of the developments following the war and the decade-long war encounter. It certainly seems to be more related to understanding of the war as an internal conflict, as a conflict that is generated inside the imperial society rather than the simple clash between different powers in Europe. Thank you.
It's such a beautiful essay, and I learned a lot from it. I really enjoyed reading it. And of course, the big task is, well, how do we draw this more into engagement with the war itself and revolution and its aftermath? And I was wondering if the Eurasianists ever explicitly spoke about it or wrote about it, about their reflections on World War I and what it meant to them, A, and then B, whether they explicitly talked about, or if you can read between the lines, what their thoughts were about a potential future civilizational level clash, another great world war, perhaps in the future. And a couple, I guess, things that happened while they were writing. There's the Allied intervention. I mean, did they ever, it's kind of, I don't want to get prosaic here when, these intellectuals are, and Trubetskoy is worried about phonemes and things, but there were things in the news that would beg for some opinions that might shed some light on where they would stand on the issues of war. And the Allied intervention is one. I just have no idea how they might respond to that. And the other one would be a little bit later, maybe with the war scare and the sort of potential of a great clash. Did they ever say anything explicitly about it, or what do you think they would say?
Other questions?
I can't help but see years gap, of course, with German collections, letters and whole collections of pamphlets, and addressing them, first of all. And the question is about the generational aspects. I mean, those people were literally the social generation apart and the age generation. And it was focus of generation that again brings us to the war also, lost by fathers.
Yes, thank you. For this, I call on both panelists now to discuss technocracy, because I think there is an element, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there is an element in idiocracy, that is the favorite Eurasianist term, that had this element of technocracy. And if this is so, it might be also a connection to the Ilias paper, which was before, to which he said this is just an entirely different context. And these people were in no way related to this context. I mean, usually these things don't happen. They don't just, completely in isolation, particularly because Ilya was talking about the paradigm, the general contours of thinking, not about specific approaches, not about specific identifications of intellectuals. So this is one. The other thing is you said it in the oral presentation, and I didn't find it in the paper. The ideas of Kabalevsky about how to structure the space of the Russian Empire. We wrote something on this together, actually, which I don't think you read. That he was more ambiguous. There is a spatial idea of the core and the periphery, but even more important, this whole thing is destabilized immediately when he talks about the axis between the city and the rural side, the countryside. That is not a core in how we think about it, right? So he's been, and that's where conservatism, elitism comes in from my first comment. He's very specific on these questions. So if you want to defend, but I don't think it's that simple core periphery and evolutionism explains it territorially or spatially.
I'd like to maybe Sergei answer Eric's question about how this fits into our bigger project. And I think most of our work has been about the destructive aspects of war. And this is in some ways a kind of accidental, productive aspect of it. I mean, creatively came out of it. I agree with you that Eurasianism is one of the most fascinating, complicated, and tragic. And I still worry about their attraction to the new fancy word and what that says about certain other assumptions that they made. But that's, I think this is, we tend to focus so much on the destructive aspect. This is kind of an alternative way of looking at the war. And it's something that really has nothing to do with either of these panels or any of the panels, but it's something that I think is missing, that I came to realize when I was teaching this course this semester, is sort of anti-war thought. And the various efforts during the war, like most notably the Zimmerwald, I was like, you people who are ancient students who never choose to take it. But what did that mean, these concepts? I mean, there were contacts during the war among the belligerent countries through either their socialists or, in my case, I know that they were negotiating about prisoners of war all the time, mostly in Copenhagen and Stockholm, when they weren't talking to each other about other things at that level. So the socialists were meeting in Zimmerwald and wherever else they could not be arrested to talk about the future of Europe after the war and how to mobilize against the war. And I learned this from Michael Howard, that we spent so much time talking about the origins of the war that we forget about the resistance to war and the peace movement, both all across Europe, that in part got turned into the Hague Conventions and then in part into the Versailles post-war settlement. But there's kind of an inevitability about a lot of studies in World War I bombed Belgrade, there were protests in German cities against the war, against any kind of attack. Having lived through New York City during the 9/11 and Baghdad and all that stuff, we protested in New York every day, so there was, and I think that's important to remember. I mean, we lost because Bush and the anti-war people lost in 1914 too, but I think that the story is not complete without that alternate perspective sometimes. So it's hard to do because there's not as much work on peace and anti-war as there is on war. And finally, I think one of the reasons that you might find, I find racialism interesting is this diversitarianism. So I look, as many of you know, for other sources of that. And I'm wondering, given what I've been reading in the Ukrainian field about sort of the impact on Ukrainian nationalism, Mazzini transmitted partly through the founder of the Likud, Jabotinsky, who celebrates the kind of nationalism of all, and then Drahomanov on the other side, who also is fascinated with provincial regional autonomy throughout Europe, from Ireland to Catalonia to wherever, but also thinking about Ukraine all the time in his own way. So, is there any connection that you're aware that the Eurasianists were thinking, or reading these guys, or considering their ideas?
And then just follow Mark's points about how this paper could be made more directly kind of linked to the project. In a way, you could sort of interrogate, I think, more Trubetskoy's claim that he started to work on C. Europa in 1911, and sort of how kind of check what could have been said, let's say, in 1910, and then couldn't have been said in 1921 without the war. And let's say you take sort of, I think, the kind of intellectual tradition from the more distant part from which Eurasianism sort of originates. It's the emerging questioning of Eurocentrism, of kind of intellectual tradition, academic work. It starts in the approximately 1880s. Germans play a big role, Russians come in. And certain statements, anti-Eurocentric statements, could have been made quite strongly in 1911. And then during the war, certainly among the figures I looked at, during the war, this criticism of kind of quite mild criticism of Eurocentrism, of, let's say, academic endeavor, turns into actual attack on European colonialism. And the word colonialism is used in the sources I work with only during the war. And sort of suggestions that, okay, people studying the Orient should kind of be more respectful to those cultures, shouldn't really measure everything by the European yardstick. During the war, turns into the claim that actually Orientological research in the West is a colonial enterprise, which deprives local people of their voice and deprives local people of kind of any possession of their own cultures. And these are statements from Maren of the book from 1915. They couldn't have been made in 1911. They are made in this context of sort of very bitter kind of controversies and hatred between different European powers. And so, if this kind of context as a precursor to Eurasianism can be maybe more kind of elaborated upon, and I'm sure you'll find kind of parallels of this kind of heightened critique of European values, European culture in other intellectual traditions outside Russia during the war. it's very interesting paper and all that to the project.
Thank you so much for the interesting talk. I'm just wondering about your opinion of the role of war experience in the life of Trubetskoy. It's quite known that he did not participate directly in the war. So in this case, it might be interesting to think of the role of this some kind of experience transmission, because it was not direct influence of war, and but it was a kind of intellectual elaboration of the war after his exile to Bulgaria. I think it might be interesting because this kind of emotional response to the war without direct participation on the war might be interesting and directed to this question of some kind of radicalization and so on, from this perspective of history of emotions probably. And another aspect is quite interesting, this question of formation of ideas, because it is quite clear that his ideas of Trubetskoy was formulated and elaborated before the war. But if we compare with Savitsky, he has published several important articles in Ruskaya Mys exactly during the war. So in this case, and formulated his ideas of the struggle of empires, a clear sense of imperial ideology, exactly influenced by Struve and so on. But I think it might be interesting to talk about Trubetskoy and Savitsky. And but another aspect is this post-colonial criticism. But for many European intellectuals, this post-colonial is also connected with anti-imperial. But for Trubetskoy and other Eurasianism, in any sense, empire holds his importance after the war. Maybe in the form of Soviet Union and so on, but empire still matters. So in this case, it's quite interesting because this post-colonial does not mean post-imperial and anti-imperial. It is only some kind of new legitimacy, new intellectual terms.
Okay, I'll give it a try. First of all, in response to Eric's question, there is no direct reflection on the war experience by the classical Eurasianists themselves, as far as I know, apart from several references in a rather obscure text by Sovchinsky on the music of Stravinsky. But what I think is very, very important is that these people congregated in Sofia in 1920-21, and the passages to exile were very important. They were through the south of Russia. Sovchinsky spent the year of late 1918, 1919 in Kiev. Savitsky worked on the Crimean government. Trubetskoy left Russia through Rostov-on-Don and then Crimea. In their letters, in their correspondence, in their memoirs, you often see this sense of sort of going through a space that is disintegrating politically. Savitsky has a fascinating description of how he defended his estate near Poltava from, I think, Petlura, I don't remember from whom exactly. Some Ukrainians, right? Although, of course, another interesting question, he was a Malaros, I never used that question about. And he also describes his encounter with the French occupation in Odessa. So there is a lot of that kind of references, and they do give you a sense of people who are deeply frustrated, not beyond frustration. They're insulted. There is a sense of, I think, personal sort of denigration. Savitsky participated in the diplomatic Denikin sent to the United States to seek help for the Denikin army. The delegation was stopped in Paris, and that's apparently where he elaborated some of his Eurasianist ideas. But we can imagine the situation of that diplomatic representative without a country to represent, where other members of the diplomatic corps don't take it really to be a diplomat of any kind. There is this particular circumstance around the experience of not just the immigration, but being a service person of a sort of government like Denikins. On the future of civilization, well, that's a fascinating question, because there are several futures of civilization as imagined by the Eurasians, because there are different Eurasians. For Sovchinsky, it was a space of sort of aesthetic creativity dominated by people like Stravinsky, Prokofiev, or avant-garde art, or the futurists. And that was very close to the vision of Ramon Jakobson, who imagined Eurasia as being a kind of a space of future scholarly creativity and innovation. That was his understanding of Eurasia. For Trubetskoy, it was an orthodox utopia, organized in almost like a Ständerstaat state of the states, and dominated by a powerful idea. That's where the term bureaucracy comes from. Not sure exactly, it's very technocratic in the modern sense, it's rather utopian, rather than technocratic. So a lot of this is present there in the life experiences, and I think this is also the response to Yuri's question about individual sort of things. And in response to Sasha's comment about Kovalevsky, of course, it's not a sort of a simple thing that Kovalevsky wanted to structure the Russian Empire in terms of space, core national space, and the ethnic periphery. But there is a sense in Kovalevsky, and certainly it comes through in the public debate with Mnuchin, that the imperial space is supposed to be sort of structured in some coordination with the idea of evolution, right, and some preparedness of peoples for the political participation. And this is something that Trubetskoy does not accept on several grounds. First, it runs counter to the notion of the unity of the Eurasian space. It runs counter to the Eurasian tradition of incorporation of different peoples into some sort of utopian, orthodox dominated state. And it runs counter to his criticism of evolution. So all of these things come together. But one should see the evaluations that Kovalevsky wrote on the works of photographers who, for example, worked in Siberia, just so of them reviewing Vitashevsky's work. You can hardly find a more aggressive sort of defense of evolutionist worldview and rather rude type, I must say, actually, in some of this articulation.
He could be rude.
Sorry?
He could be rude.
Yeah, very, very aristocratic, very condescending, but also rude. And finally, in response to Mark's comment about the creative nature of this, I think it's an interesting way to think about some of the outcomes of World War I as creative or productive. And I was, when I listened to your comment, I was actually thinking about how the experience of World War I helped some of these people live through World War II, because many of them did. And we have the tradition of Pontigny seminars in France, which were attended by French and German and Russian intellectuals, in which were actually imagined as a space of intellectual exchange after World War I. And the Pontigny seminars, of course, were restored in the United States by Jean Malle in 1942. And there is an irony of history, and that's where Lévi-Strauss and Jakobson exchanged their views on the campus of Mount Holyoke College. In the context of so there is some interesting, I don't know, creativity that comes from the separation of intellectual communities in the war, or at least the perceived intellectual separation of this community. Ilya mentioned the generational aspect, and this is absolutely important, both in terms of how this group of very, very young people, and most of them matured right on the eve of the collapse of Imperial Russia and the war effort. They went to the university throughout the war years, which, by the way, is very interesting because actually it might have been an experience of some of them to go to Germany and study there. And Trubetskoy did. He studied with Linder, but just on the eve of the war, he came back, I think, in 13. What I think it relates to is the audience of many of the great ideologues, and the audience, whatever, young, relatively poorly educated officers who began their conscious lives as adults in 1914, 13, 15, by entering the army, and then most of the experience was warfare, and then followed by exile, where they had no skills or qualifications of any kind. This is the major audience of people who actually read these kinds of texts. And finally, I just want to thank Vera for a very interesting comment about what could be said in 1911 and what could have been permitted by, I guess, the discourse itself. It's very interesting to think about what he has done and his rhetoric from Kant to the book, because it does relate to some of the anger that you see in Trubetskoy.